Welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Traceability and Other Technical Aspects of a Recall, hosted by the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association and presented by Dr. Jennifer Mcintyre of the United Fresh Produce Association and one of the 3 members of the Recall Ready team. This is the 4th webinar in our Crisis Communications webinar series. Feel free to access all 5 webinars found on the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association website at www.gfvga.org. I am Beth Olson, Director of Education and Food Safety for the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and will be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, let's go over just a few housekeeping items. Please note, this is a pre-recorded webinar, but even being a pre-recorded webinar, technology has made it possible for you to submit questions at any time during this webinar. Simply type your questions into the questions text box. At the end of this webinar, all submitted questions will be sent to us and we will send answers via email. There will be an FAQ housed on the GFVGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. If you experience any issues with the audio coming through your computer speakers, please make sure your computer speakers are on and the volume is turned up. If you're still experiencing problems, you may also use the telephone dial-in option. And lastly, I'd like to draw your attention to the handout box on the webinar control box. The handout box contains links to today's presentation and other useful tools such as Is Your Company Prepared for a Recall Checklist, produced by the United Fresh Recall Ready program. Now, with the housekeeping items behind us, let's get to the webinar. Again, today's webinar, Traceability and Other Technical Aspects of a Recall, will help you analyze if your food safety and traceability systems will hold up to the demands of a recall. Again, this is the 5th of 5 webinars in a series designed to help prepare for a crisis before it happens. Industry experts would agree the best time to prepare for a crisis is not once it happens. And for the larger majority of instances, most crises are not expected. The Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association has a crisis communication and management plan available for members to use as an outline to create a specific communication and management plan for their farm or produce operation. It's designed to conform and help address most any crisis, including a foodborne illness, labor shortage, weather, or even the unfortunate accidental employee death. The 5 webinars in this crisis communication series are designed to provide high-level information and overview in a short amount of time. After the webinar, if more in-depth or technical information is needed, you're welcome to contact me, Beth Olson, with the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, any of the 3 presenters from the Recall Ready program, or attend a Recall Ready workshop offered through the United Fresh Produce Association. Speaking of the Recall Ready team, today our presenter is one of the Recall Ready team trio, Dr. Jennifer Mcintyre, Vice President of Food Safety and Technology at United Fresh Produce Association. A food microbiologist by background, she has always worked in the Washington, D.C. area, bringing the scientific perspective to food safety regulatory issues. While serving as the Director of Science and Technology Projects at the Institution of Food Technologists, Jennifer led multiple traceability-related projects for the FDA and others, including conducting traceability pilots in support of the Food Safety Modernization Act and launching the Traceability Improvement Initiative. She serves as an advisory board member to the Global Food Traceability Center, on the technical committee of the Center for Produce Safety, and is on the executive committee of the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance. It is with this wealth of expertise and renown that I now turn the program over to Dr. Jennifer Mcintyre. Jennifer, welcome.
Hey, Beth, thank you so much for having me. And I think that it's pretty awesome that you guys get to put this package, this suite of webinars together for your members because, as you said, a crisis usually is unexpected and catches people off guard. And it's, it's never fun. It's never a comfortable feeling. But to the extent that you can understand the language that the regulators are using, understand the questions that your customers, that media may be asking, understand your own systems and how they're going to work, I think that it really is important for that preparedness. So I appreciate you having me here to talk about traceability, which is one of my favorite topics, in part because it is so confusing. I think we use the word traceability and it means different things to different people. So what I'd like to talk about today is what traceability means in the context of a recall and even how it depends on what's prompting the recall. So I'll start with the outbreak investigations because lately traceability has been in the news a lot. As we look at the romaine lettuce outbreaks, as we look at papaya, cyclospora, so there are numerous examples where FDA has cited this lack of industry traceability. And I know as I've talked to our members of the produce industry, everybody feels like, I have good traceability. What are you talking about? So let's start with, let's start from a different angle here. So to kick things off, I would ask everybody to ask themselves, what did you eat for breakfast and lunch and dinner and any snacks, but not just today, not just yesterday, but what did you eat for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks like 2 weeks ago? So say you are that person that got sick. You are that person who had a foodborne illness and you wound up going to the doctor and the doctor has to go and take the stool samples and all that and figures out, oh, you might have a foodborne illness that probably happened several days, maybe a week before you went to the doctor, and then it's going to be some time to get those test results back. So we're talking, a couple weeks ago. Do you remember? Do you have a record of what you ate? And the health departments are going to go around and they're going to ask everybody who got sick, what did they eat, and see if there's some food in common. Some food in common in your city, in your town, in your state, and in different parts of the country. And if they hone in on a food that seems to be popping up more often than it normally would, then they're going to ask, well, where did you buy it from? And so how are you supposed to remember? They're coming back to you. So it may be several weeks now. Oh, this particular food, where did you buy it from? What restaurant did you eat at? So we're heavily reliant at the get-go on people's recollection of what they ate. What did you eat? Where did you get it from? And who can tell you from a product a few weeks ago what was the lot number? So I think one of the main disconnects that I see in the industry is that when companies talk about how we have great traceability, that's usually followed by the statement, if you give me the lot number, I can tell you within seconds, minutes, exactly where that product came from, when it was grown, who harvested it. But the challenge that we have in an outbreak situation is that we don't know the lot number. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. What was that lot number? Who was that grower or processor or packer where the problem occurred? So we're starting with this complete lack of information, even from the beginning, figuring out, was this even related to food? And then which food, where did it come from? And trying to figure out the lot number. So as you think about your traceability systems and what traceability means to you, you really have to look at it from a very different angle, and one that, in my experience, people's mock recalls, their mock tracebacks, totally don't cover. But it's this complexity and this asking of questions that leads FDA down, so many supply chain paths. So I know that this is a super busy kind of schematic, but on the left-hand side, those are all the establishments, all those points of service, grocery stores, restaurants, where people ate something that made them sick and where public health has some sense of what the product is. And then it's following it through distribution, following it through if there's importers involved, if there's domestic growers, packers, until you get to that point on the right where there are still many possibilities, but there's one that, a couple of arrows point to, where you say, well, this is probably the source of the problem. But it takes a long time, and it takes looking through traceability records for every single box that you see on this graph here, every single box, multiple records looking through them to figure out what do they have in common. And that's a very different task than what an individual company is doing when they're doing their mock recall, mock traceback, and saying, oh, we feel good, we think that we have a great traceability. Now, not every use of a traceability system is that use case. So traceability does require context. If the reason for your recall is because there's been a product that sampled positive, because you've had a customer complaint, somebody has that product at the time. They have the box, they have the lot number. So when the packaging, the case still remains, they can read that information back to you. That's the instance where you've got the lot number, you can put it into your system and learn an awful lot about the product. But as I just described, when there's an outbreak, the packaging is gone. By the time an outbreak is realized, it's weeks past. And we are relying on just what information was captured. So if you use the Produce Traceability Initiative label, the GS1-128 barcode, which I'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, you're slapping that barcode on. You're saying, I'm putting that traceability information on my case, but the question is anybody capturing it? Especially at that point where somebody is eating the product at retail or at food service. If retail and food service or the distributors before them are capturing the lot number, are you sure that it's yours? It's fascinating when you go, when you see that case at the beginning of its life and then toward the end of its life, it may have many different numbers on it. It may have a few different barcodes on it. So how can you expect that people have captured the right information if you're even providing it and they're capturing anything? So what happens in this circumstance is when the records requests are issued by the regulators, are you able to mine your data, whatever systems you have, ideally electronic? I'm a big advocate of electronic record keeping. I know that a lot of people do still use paper. And how are you going to pull out all the lot numbers that went to a certain customer just in a certain time frame and try to figure out what they have in common, whether that's through purchase orders or bills of lading, or maybe even just invoices? How do you start to look at this kind of larger volume to try to figure out what is that lot number that's in common? So, and then let me show you an example of is it product specific or one line amongst many? So even companies that say that they have good records, great records, we're keeping the information that is necessary to establish these links in the supply chain. Who else can make sense of it? So we did an exercise at our convention this past June where I had done the exercise prior, asking a member for some traceability sort of information and trying to pick out of all these numbers on a sheet, what are the numbers that I am interested in? What am I playing the role of, a fake regulator during a traceback? What am I looking for? And it's a few numbers that you have to kind of tease out. So how can you make it easier, even if you understand your own systems, how can you decipher this information for somebody else? Because it's not you doing the traceback. If there's an issue, it's turning those records, turning that information over to somebody else when there's an outbreak. If it's a product that tests positive, again, I think that's a much simpler scenario and one that's maybe a little more comfortable to manage. Not that it's comfortable when you get a product positive, but it is a little bit more comfortable to manage. So some traceability issues, mistakes. Traceability is about accounting. It's about matching the movement of product and having that record match the actual, the actual flow of product. And stuff can get lost in that accounting. So is it through rework? And I would include repacking in rework. So how do you know what origin went into what finished product, and anything that maybe didn't meet a quality spec, didn't meet a size spec, that got put somewhere else, mixed in with something else? How is that accounted for? How is that tracked? Other ingredients. So if you have waxes, coatings, other things that are added to your product, even in a minimal amount, what if there's a problem there? And how do you know how much of your product was affected? It may not be just that one lot number. It may be something more expansive. The packaging itself. If you're starting to mix things, combine things, you're doing, the stoplight of peppers. Are your records complete? Are they actually correct? Are they accurate? And back to that question of, what if an issue affects more than just one lot? How do you even define a lot? And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Have any samples been removed from the system? Has any product been removed from the system that you can no longer account for because it went to QA, it went to sales, it got donated or sold internally or otherwise discarded? Can you keep track of all the product that you actually harvested, that you actually packed? Let me talk a little bit about the traceability requirements that are on the books today. And I should point out, although it is not stated in a bullet here, that these traceability requirements, they stem from the Bioterrorism Act, and so there's a record-keeping requirement that applies to registered facilities. We could have a whole conversation about, do you need to register if you're a packing house? It's explicit that these requirements here do not apply to farms. However, I would think you'd want to give some critical thought to what are the records I am keeping and what role do I play in the supply chain, whether there's a regulatory requirement or not. So the requirements on the books are, a little bit lax, and I'd say as we look at the system, it doesn't seem that these current requirements are adequate. So it's, what is the previous source? Is the farm? That would be, that could be you. Who is the immediate subsequent recipient, whether domestic or foreign, inclusive of transportation, and the nature of the information that needs to be made available to FDA is the name of the firm, the address, phone number. There's a little more flexibility around the next bullet, the brand name, how you describe the food. Everybody describes their stuff a little bit differently. The date received, well, how do you match up the date that something was shipped by one entity to the date it was received by the other? Lot numbers, and it's lot numbers if available. So there's quite a loophole there, again, in trying to, if you don't have a lot number, how do you match up what somebody shipped and somebody received? And then a quantity and how it was packaged. So again, farms at the one end of the supply chain are excluded from the requirements. Restaurants at the other end of the supply chain are excluded from the requirements. And for all intents and purposes, even grocery stores, the stores themselves are not exactly subject to these requirements because it's going through their distribution centers usually first. So there are record keeping requirements on the books today, but again, as we look at the nature of the records that are being kept, the lack of a standardized format to communicate this information, you can see why there's some real challenges when you have so many points of sale, points of service where people are getting sick and the agencies are trying to trace back through the supply chain. So many years ago now, over a decade ago, United, PMA, and CPMA came together, and GS1 joined a little bit later to launch the Produce Traceability Initiative. And this is something I highly encourage you to look into if you're not using a PTI label right now. So it's producetraceability.org. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's using a common language, a global language, to communicate information, standardized information about your product, so that if you provide that label, if you identify your product as you ship it out, it should be easy for somebody to capture that information. Now, there's labor involved, and the volume, the flow of products, especially for fresh produce, it presents some challenges, but still at this point in time, I think that the Produce Traceability Initiative adoption is where we as an industry need to look at. And it is, if you've heard about blockchain, if you're thinking about blockchain, the use of PTI is a prerequisite to the successful use of blockchain. So blockchain can't work, it can't connect the dots if we're not speaking a common language, and that's provided through PTI. So those are the main points that I wanted to make on traceability right now. I'm going to shift over a little bit to another technical question that I'm often asked when somebody gets wrapped up in some sort of an issue, any type of a food safety related issue, which is, but I have a certificate of analysis that says that it's okay, or I still have some of this product and I can go ahead and I can test it. And so will testing exonerate you? I feel pretty confident saying that I can't think of a single instance where testing would get you off the hook. And let me explain a little bit from the statistical standpoint of why. This table, it comes from the ICMSF, a recognized, well-renowned body, and it's a little, if you just glance at it, it's not the most intuitive table, so let me walk you through it. On the left-hand side, we have the composition of a lot, and you'll see there's the percent acceptable and percent defective. Let's just look at the first row, that 98% and 2%. 2% means that 2% of your product, 2 out of every 100, 1 out of every 50, is contaminated. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, geez, if 1 out of every 50 was contaminated, that's a lot. So we assume, we hope, we strive for 0. We know we're never going to get there. A lot of the research that just, does general product testing finds that depending on the commodity, depending on some other factors, we maybe hover around that 1-ish % for a lot of products. So this table doesn't even go down to 1%. So let's keep that in mind. So this is assuming 2%, and that 2% contamination is pretty evenly distributed. So this is not the circumstance where you have like an animal that makes a deposit on, just one item. It's something that's evenly distributed. Now, as we move toward the larger right side of the table, the question that's asked is, if you do testing, what is the likelihood that you're going to think, despite the fact that there's this 2% contamination rate, what's the likelihood that you're going to think, based on the test result, that this lot is okay? And naturally, the more you test, the more likely it is that you are going to find a positive. So if you only take 3 samples and you've got a 1 in 50 contamination rate, there is a 94% chance that you are not going to find that 1 in 50. Some people within a lot of the food industry, they talk about N60 sampling. So that means that you take 60 samples, that they are all tested individually, so not all combined, not compositive, but 60 individual samples, 60 individual tests. If you do it that way, there is still, with 60 samples, there's still a 30% chance that you're going to get it wrong. You're going to miss it. So this is exactly why you can say somebody found a positive, you tested it, and you found a negative. Well, the statistics would say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It doesn't mean that the lot didn't have some contamination in it to begin with. It just means that one person who tested got lucky, one person that tested got unlucky. And whether you view yourself as the lucky or the unlucky one, I guess depends on your perspective. But given the, ideally the low likelihood of contamination, the lower the true level of contamination is, the less useful testing is, the less likely you are to find something. So don't hang your hat on testing. If you do find that positive, then you do need to take action. And, if we want, we can talk about that a little bit later. So, and part of it, part of the testing kind of interpretation of results is, what does that mean for your lot? Again, if you have a good food safety system going, those contamination events should be few and far between. And how you define your lot is really reflective of the risk, the business decisions, the risk that you're willing to take. So how much of that crop, how much of that product are you willing to lose in a recall? And how can you defend that one lot that the conditions of growth or the conditions of packing, processing are different from one lot to the next? So what are some factors that you can consider? You can, if you're washing product, is there antimicrobial in that wash water that would limit cross-contamination? And are you sure? Can you actually show that, yes, it would limit cross-contamination, or that we've changed the water? So questions around, is the water reused? What else was run in that water? So was it just one commodity, or then did you move on to another commodity? So there are a lot of, from the scientific side, from the food safety side, there are a lot of questions you need to ask if you find yourself in a potential recall situation due to a food safety issue. What else was run along those lines? Again, how can you defend that one thing was contaminated perhaps, but something else wasn't? Do you have effective cleaning and sanitation? Can you defend that? And then on the growing side, were you using a common water source, or was there a weather-related issue that could have affected more than just that one product that first comes to your attention? At the point that something bad happens and you get past it, so there is that crisis, and you've got to solve this issue right now. You've got to respond to the regulators, you've got to respond to your customers. Then you may be breathing a sigh of relief, but your work is not done. So there's the root cause investigation of figuring out what went wrong, and really making that I would suggest a documented effort to show your investigation and to show what you're going to change moving forward. If you are under the preventive controls rule, which I suspect most listeners to this webinar probably aren't, you're probably under produce safety rule, there's a regulatory requirement to do this food safety plan reanalysis. And one of the triggers is that something went wrong, that your food safety plan didn't quite work. There was an unanticipated problem, and that's a trigger to go back and reevaluate the system and make some adjustments. Even if you're under the produce safety rule, and technically you don't have to have a food safety plan, even though I know many growers do, it's still a really good idea to do this exercise and to put those preventive measures in place, because if something went wrong once, what's to say it can't happen again? And that's something that you should be guarding against. So traceability is the side, it's kind of after the fact. Let's do our best to prevent issues from occurring in the first place. So with that, Beth, I will conclude. But I guess I'm a little, if you're willing, I'm a little bit curious of any feedback that you have, any, does this jive with things that you've heard from your members, or do you have any questions? And as Beth mentioned, you have the opportunity to send in questions, and to me, that's always the most fun part. So Beth, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. So, in looking at all of this, I feel like lots of our members are tracking along with what you have laid out here. This last portion is really a sweet spot that I feel like we've really come into contact lately with, how to respectfully push back on with state or federal regulators when they're wanting to push a recall or a traceback exercise further than what we feel that the evidence really is looking at. And so being able to understand what are the legal components that we need to make sure that we're carrying from a Food Safety Modernization Act and from the preventive controls and from the food safety, produce safety rule. So, where are we legally, and how are we making sure that we're in compliance? But then beyond that, what is just kind of a preference of an auditor or an inspector rather, and there's things that they want to see. So this whole pushback and being able to defend a position and not just lay down and accept whatever requests that they may be bringing to us. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and I've seen both ends of the spectrum, where you have some companies who, in the face of pretty compelling evidence, still push back, and my view is that they're on the losing side, that they're not accepting of the evidence, that they don't get maybe some of the nature of testing and what it means and how to interpret things, and they haven't built that case to defend their position. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, where you do have some companies that they know their stuff, and the agencies sometimes try to be a little bit pushy, a little bit of aggressive, and that's where I think having good documentation and having good communication, to be able to explain your position and explain how you came to the conclusion that you came to, and why you don't agree that the agency's conclusion is sound. And I know that's an area, Beth, that you at the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, that's a service you provide to members. It's a service I provide to members to try to facilitate those conversations, because most companies, or an awful lot of companies who find themselves in that position, in that dialogue, they haven't had those conversations before, and it can be very intimidating and really scary and nerve-wracking when somebody is accusing you of something. And of course you want to do the right thing, you want to do the right thing for public health, but you don't want to be a pushover. So I would encourage anybody who has any hesitation, any discomfort, I'll offer you up, Beth, even though, you didn't say I could, but, call Beth or call me.
Absolutely.
At associations, that's what we do.
Absolutely. Well, and this goes along with webinar number 3 of this crisis communication series. David Durkin with OFW Law, he presented, and it's When FDA Comes a Knockin'. So it's a very good, about 30-minute presentation about when FDA comes, what they're going to be looking for, what they're going to be asking for, what you're legally required to provide, and then some policies that everybody needs to make sure that they have in writing. So it was a very, very good webinar, and it goes hand in hand with what you and I are talking about right now.
And that's why I work closely with David.
Fantastic. Well, so something else that you've mentioned that I'll bring up is earlier in 2019, there was the statement issued from FDA regarding their plans to usher, quote, the U.S. food industry into a new era of smarter food safety. And then it goes on to talk about leveraging the use of new and emerging technologies to create more digital and traceable and safer system. And so when I read that and just kind of been mulling over it the past few months, I'm wondering what that's going to turn into. And there's the big blockchain discussion that has come out over the past year or so. And knowing that Mr. Frank Yanis, who is the Deputy Commissioner of FDA, formerly with Walmart, is a huge blockchain fan. So I've kind of wondered if that may be something that we see FDA strongly encourage our industry, maybe even other food industries, to move forward or move into. Do you have any thoughts or concerns about that?
The way I look at it is, so much of our personal and professional lives are digital today.
Yes.
I can go on my phone right now and I can change the temperature in my house 50 miles away. And I can do my banking online. And digital data that's what we well, not me, it's not what I grew up with, but people younger than me, it's what they're growing up with. And it's just
Right.
a normal part of what we do. And I think that it's, that the food industry overall would be well advised to look at how do you make those digital data a normal part of the growing, harvesting, production of food. So, we can talk about FSMA, and I know that especially on the produce safety rule side, we still have some unresolved issues, despite the fact that FSMA was passed 8.5 years ago. But
I cannot believe it's been that long. Good grief.
And life today is different than it was 8.5 years ago. So I don't want to see us as an industry get stuck with the, what was current, what was modern 8.5 years ago isn't going to be relevant today or tomorrow. We do need to continue to adapt and adjust. And, is blockchain like the answer for everybody? I think we can make I know that we'll make tremendous strides just through the use of standards and just through the digitization of data, speaking a common language. To me, then blockchain, maybe becomes the icing on the cake if people want to have another platform to share those data, but you've got to have good quality information that you can communicate with others to begin with. So I know FDA is going to be having some public meetings. I know they haven't been announced yet, but I'm hopeful that within, the coming months that all of us have the opportunity to give our feedback on what does a smarter era of food safety actually look like. And, I know that United Fresh will offer comments. I'm sure you'll offer comments, but everybody should know that even as individual operations or even as individual consumers, you have the opportunity to give comment and feedback. And I think we need to show the agencies that we are progressive as an industry. And also, as a side comment, if we want to attract new talent, attract younger generations into this industry, we've got to be modern. We've got to be cool. And, you look at some of the systems we have today, and I don't think we're always quite there.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. I feel like you have encapsulated this very nicely in a short amount of time, and just helped us and the attendees take a realistic look at their food safety and traceability systems and how we all need to maybe tweak them a little bit to hold up to the demands of a recall. So in closing, just a reminder to all the listeners that this is a pre-recorded webinar, but again, you can still submit questions and we will answer them. Again, to submit a question, please type your question into the questions text box and press send located next to the box. At the end of the webinar, all submitted questions will come to us and we will email all answers to the individuals. We will also keep a running FAQ document on the GFEGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. In closing, thank you again, Jennifer Mcintyre with the United Fresh Produce Association, for sharing your time and expertise with us during this webinar. Additionally, I'd like to thank every one of you who have joined in. You will be receiving a post-webinar evaluation to provide feedback on this webinar as well as help guide future topics. Additionally, please feel free to contact the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association or Jennifer with future questions. We encourage you to explore the handouts box on the side of your screen for useful tools related to today's topic. Thank you for your participation in this webinar. This concludes today's program.